There is a feeling some people carry quietly, for years, without ever saying it out loud. Not the feeling of wanting more money, or a better job, or a bigger house. Something older than that. Something underneath all of it. The way a foundation sits underneath a house you can't see from the street. The feeling that your life is not simply happening to you, that it is pointing somewhere. Maybe you felt it standing in a hospital room, holding someone's hand, knowing more clearly than you have ever known anything that you were meant to be in that exact spot, at that exact hour, and nowhere else. Maybe you felt it driving home from a job that pays the bills and empties you at the same time, wondering how a life can look so complete on paper and so hollow in the front seat of your own car. Maybe you feel it right now, 3 in the morning, certain, without evidence, without proof, that you were built for something you have not yet done. You have watched people around you settle into ordinary satisfactions, a promotion, a renovation, a vacation photo that gets 40 likes, and felt a quiet, almost guilty distance from all of it. Not because those things are wrong, because none of them ever quite reach the part of you that is asking for something else. You have probably wondered if that feeling means anything at all, or if it is only a story you tell yourself to survive an ordinary life. What if it is not a story? What if that feeling is the first sign? Not a sign that you are better than the person next to you. Not a sign that you were handed a destiny no one else received. A sign that something has been quietly preparing you for years, in ways you never labeled as preparation at the time, and that you are closer than you think to finally recognizing it. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to look back at your own life and see it differently than you saw it an hour ago. I want to be honest with you before we go any further, because this idea gets misunderstood constantly, and I refuse to let it get misunderstood here tonight. I am not saying God picks a few favorites and abandons everyone else. That has never been the story of Scripture, and it is not the story of this video. Every serious tradition that has ever spoken about calling ends up saying the same thing underneath the language. The invitation goes out to everyone. What differs, person to person, generation to generation, is who actually answers. So when I use the word chosen tonight, I do not mean superior, I mean available. Chosen is not something that happens to the lucky few, the way a lottery happens to whoever holds the winning ticket. It is something that becomes true the moment a person stops running from what their own life has been trying to tell them, for years, in a language they finally learn to read. This is worth repeating, because it is the single most common way this idea gets twisted. The moment someone hears chosen, some part of the mind reaches for comparison. Chosen over whom? Better than whom? That instinct is understandable, but it misses the actual shape of the offer entirely. Being called was never a ranking. It was never a way of sorting people into worthy and unworthy. It is closer to a door standing open in every single life, at different points, in different forms, waiting to see who is willing to walk through it. This is what we're going to do for the next hour. I am going to walk you through 7 signs, 7 patterns that show up again and again in the lives of people who are being prepared for something larger than the life they are currently living. Some of these will feel obvious to you before I even finish describing them. Others will take a moment to land because you have spent years interpreting them the wrong way, filing them under bad luck instead of preparation. None of the 7 arrive with a label attached. Nobody hands you a certificate that says, "This hardship was training," or "This restlessness was a summons." They arrive disguised as ordinary life, and it is only much later, sometimes decades later, that a person looks back and finally sees the shape underneath the noise. If 2 or 3 of these resonate, pay attention. If 4 or 5 resonate, I want you to genuinely sit with what I am about to say, not just nod along and keep scrolling through your own life on autopilot. And if most of them apply to you, then what follows may be the clearest explanation you have ever received for why your life unfolded exactly the way it did. I am not going to ask you to believe anything on my word alone. I am going to describe each sign in enough detail that you can test it against your own memory, your own body, your own history, and decide for yourself whether it holds. That is the only kind of proof that has ever actually mattered here. Not my conviction, yours. There is research on purpose that keeps landing on the same finding across very different populations. People who describe a clear sense of purpose tend to weather hardship differently than people who don't. Not because their hardship is smaller, because they are interpreting it inside a story that is still moving forward, instead of a story that simply happened to them and ended there. That distinction between a life that happened and a life that is still unfolding towards something is what tonight is actually about. And here is the stake, and I will not soften it. The tragedy was never going to be that you weren't chosen. Every person listening to my voice tonight was called the same offer, extended without exception. The tragedy, if it happens at all, will be that you heard the call clearly, at some point, in some form, and spent the rest of your life pretending you hadn't. Think about how that tragedy actually unfolds, because it rarely announces itself. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to abandon their calling in a single dramatic moment. It happens gradually, in 1,000 small postponements. Not today. I'm too busy. Not this year. The timing isn't right. Maybe when the kids are older, when the mortgage is paid off, when I finally feel ready. Readiness never actually arrives on its own schedule. It arrives the moment someone decides to move, despite its absence. Before we go there, if you have already felt one of your own signs stirring in the last few minutes, follow this channel right now, while it's fresh, as a small down payment on staying for the rest of the 7. You can always change your mind later. Just don't lose this thread before you've heard it in full. Let's start where the pattern always starts. Not with the gift, not with the mission, with the wound. Sign number 1 is this: the difficulty you survived was never wasted. It was preparation disguised as damage, and most people never live long enough to see the disguise come off. I want you to think back, not to reopen pain for its own sake, but to notice something you may never have noticed before. Think about the hardest season of your early life. The poverty that taught you to be resourceful before you had the vocabulary for the word resourceful. The household where you were criticized more often than you were encouraged, so you learned to validate yourself from the inside because nobody was supplying it from the outside. The learning difference that made school feel like walking uphill every single day, while everyone around you walked flat ground and never once noticed the incline you were on. The abuse that taught you, far too early, how to read a room before anyone in it had spoken a single word. Most people carry those memories as proof that something went wrong, as if the difficulty itself is evidence that they were somehow unworthy of an easier path, singled out for suffering the way other people get singled out for good fortune. But watch what actually happened in your body and your mind while you were surviving that season, because something did happen, whether you asked for it or not. You developed something. You did not choose to develop it. It was forced into you by circumstance. But it is there now, and it belongs to you. Think about how resistance training actually works, physically, in the body. A muscle does not grow because life is comfortable. It grows because it is placed under a load heavier than what it is used to carrying, and it adapts. The tissue tears in small, controlled ways, and then it rebuilds itself denser and stronger than it was before the load was applied. No trainer looks at that torn tissue and calls it damage. They call it the mechanism. It is the entire point. Your early adversity worked on you the same way, whether or not you understood what was happening at the time. The child who grew up with too little money often becomes the adult who can solve a real problem with almost nothing to work with. A kind of resourcefulness people with easier starts simply never had reason to build. The person who was doubted constantly as a child often becomes the adult with an almost unreasonable amount of internal resolve, because they had to manufacture their own belief when no one around them was supplying it for free. The person who struggled to learn the way school expected everyone to learn often becomes the adult who can explain difficult things simply and patiently, because they had to translate the world into language they could actually use, long before anyone else in the room needed that particular skill. Consider someone who spent their childhood being told, directly or in 100 smaller ways, that they weren't especially smart. That word follows a person. It gets repeated in their own head long after the people who said it have forgotten saying it at all. And yet, watch what a person like that so often becomes by their 30s or 40s. Someone who reads compulsively, questions relentlessly, refuses to accept a shallow explanation for anything, because being underestimated once was so unbearable that they built an entire mind determined never to be caught unprepared again. The insult became the architecture. Nobody handed them that mind. They built it, one humiliation at a time, without ever intending to. Or consider someone who watched a marriage end in their 30s, publicly, the kind of ending people whisper about at gatherings for a year afterward. That kind of loss can either shrink a person permanently or teach them something almost no comfortable marriage ever teaches. How to rebuild a self from the studs up. How to sit with silence instead of fleeing it. How to trust their own judgment again after trusting it once and watching it fail. Years later, that same person often becomes the one friends call first when their own life falls apart, not because they have all the answers, but because they have already walked through the exact fire being described to them. This is not a technique for making suffering feel good, and I want to be careful here, because some of what happened to you should not have happened, full stop. I am not asking you to thank the people who caused it, and I am not telling you the difficulty was somehow secretly a gift wrapped in cruelty. I am asking you to notice what your nervous system, your character, and your capacity quietly built while you were simply trying to get through an ordinary, difficult day. Because almost nobody tells you this part. The very thing you spent years being ashamed of, or trying to explain away, or hoping no one would ever ask about directly, may be exactly the training your mission required, not despite the difficulty. Because of it. Being chosen was never about being better. It was always about becoming available. And the weight you carried early, the weight you may still be setting down even now, may be the very thing that built the strength no comfortable life could ever have handed you. Now, if the first sign lives in your history, the second sign usually lives somewhere closer to your relationship with the divine, or the absence of one. Picture a child sitting in a pew every Sunday for 18 years, reciting words about a God they were never actually introduced to. Now picture a different child, in a different house, where God's name never came up at all, not once, the way some families never discuss money or grief. Both children grow into adults carrying the exact same quiet gap. They've just filled it with different furniture. Sign number 2 is this: a broken or distant relationship with God, followed by a crisis that finally forces you to look up. Some of you grew up with no God at all. Faith simply wasn't part of the house you were raised in, and you have spent your adult life either ignoring the question entirely or circling it from a careful, safe distance, the way you'd circle a subject you weren't sure you were allowed to bring up at dinner. Others grew up with religion, but not with God, a version of faith built more on rules and performance and fear of punishment than on any actual relationship. You learned exactly what to say in church. You never quite learned how to know the one you were saying it to. And some of you grew up inside a faith that hurt you, where God's name was used to control, to shame, to justify things that had nothing to do with love at all. If that is your story, I want to slow down here, because that wound deserves more than a passing sentence. What was done to you in the name of God is not the same thing as God. A distorted picture of the divine, handed to you by imperfect, sometimes cruel people, does not disqualify you from a real relationship with the real thing. It may actually be the very reason you are searching now, more carefully than the people who never questioned anything ever will. Notice the pattern that shows up, again and again, in the lives of people who go on to walk in a larger calling. At some point, often later than they expected, often after they had already built a life that looked stable from the outside, something happens that they cannot manage on their own. A diagnosis, a collapse, a loss too large to reason their way out of with willpower alone. And in that moment, for the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, they stop trying to control the outcome and they look up. There is an old story about a young man who never wanted the assignment he was given. He doubted himself openly, told the voice calling him that he didn't know how to speak, that he was too young, that surely there was someone more qualified. The answer he received was not a list of his qualifications. It was this: "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were even shaped, I had already set you apart." That line matters here for one reason. His calling was never contingent on him feeling ready for it. It preceded his readiness entirely, which means the years he spent doubting himself, and the years many of you have spent doubting yourselves in exactly the same way, were never evidence that you were unqualified. They were simply the gap between being chosen and becoming aware of it. If your relationship with God was inherited rather than chosen, handed to you by your family, your culture, your community, but never actually yours in any sense you could point to, there is something important sitting in that gap. An inherited faith and a chosen faith are not the same thing, even though they use the same words in the same order. One is a costume you were dressed in as a child. The other is a relationship you walked into with your eyes open, usually only after you had already lost the version that was handed to you and discovered you missed something you had never actually possessed. So if you grew up far from God, or wounded by a version of faith that never should have been called faith at all, and something has recently cracked you open enough to look upward again, pay very close attention to that crack. It is not weakness. It is not desperation dressed up as devotion. It is very often the second sign, arriving exactly on schedule, even though it never feels like schedule while you're inside it. The pattern is simple, even when it doesn't feel simple from where you're standing. Distance, then crisis, then the kind of looking up that only happens once control has genuinely run out. Not because you are broken beyond use, because you finally stopped pretending you could carry this alone. And here is something worth sitting with before we move on. The relationship you eventually build, on the far side of that crisis, tends to be sturdier than the one you would have inherited without ever being tested. A faith that has never been questioned is brittle in ways its owner rarely discovers until pressure is applied. A faith that survived your own distance, your own doubt, your own season of walking away, has already been tested once, and it held. That is not a lesser relationship with God. It is very often the more durable one. Let's talk about the third sign, because this one tends to hide in plain sight, so close to you that you have probably never once considered it might be the answer you were looking for. Look at any creature in the natural world, and you'll notice its physical traits are never decorative. A hawk's eyes are built for extraordinary distance, because a hawk's function requires spotting prey from far above. A hummingbird's wings move the way they do because its function requires hovering in place while it feeds, something almost no other bird can manage. Nothing about the design is random or ornamental. The form exists to serve the function. You were not designed differently than the rest of creation. Sign number 3 is this. You carry a natural capacity that other people have noticed in you for years, and you have quietly, persistently dismissed it as nothing. Every person alive carries something they do without effort that other people struggle to do at all. For some of you it is listening, genuinely listening, the kind where people leave a conversation with you feeling more understood than they have felt in months. For others, it is pattern recognition, the ability to see the shape of a problem before anyone else in the room can name it out loud. For some, it is music, or the particular gift of sitting with a frightened child and making them feel safe within a minute of arriving. For others, it is honesty, delivered without cruelty, or the rare capacity to take something complicated and explain it so simply that people finally understand what they'd been circling for years without a map. The capacity you were born with, or developed so early it feels like something you were born with, is not decoration either. It is not simply a nice trait that makes you good at parties or useful at the office. It is a tool, and a tool implies a purpose it was built to accomplish, whether or not you have ever picked it up on purpose. Most people treat their natural gift the way they'd treat a hobby, something pleasant, something they're faintly embarrassed to take seriously, because taking it seriously would mean admitting it might actually matter, so the gift gets minimized. I'm just good with people. I just notice things. It's nothing, really. There is a particular kind of grief in watching someone do this for decades. A person who could genuinely change the room they walk into, quietly deciding, year after year, that their gift is too ordinary to matter, simply because it came easily. Ease gets mistaken for insignificance constantly, as if the only capacities worth respecting are the ones that cost a person visible struggle. But the hawk did not earn its eyesight through effort either. It was simply built that way, for a reason that had nothing to do with how hard the hawk worked for it. It is not nothing. It is the exact instrument your mission is going to require you to use. Think of someone who spent their whole life being told they were too sensitive, someone who felt other people's pain almost physically, who left every difficult conversation exhausted the way most people leave a long shift of manual labor. For years, that person believed sensitivity was simply a flaw to manage, something to apologize for. And then, later, in some room they never expected to be standing in, that same sensitivity became the exact reason someone finally felt safe enough to say the true thing out loud for the first time in years. The wound became the instrument. Nothing about the sensitivity changed. only the interpretation did. The question was never whether you have the tool. You already have it, and you've had it long enough that you stopped noticing it was even remarkable, the way you stopped noticing the sound of your own heartbeat. The real question is whether you keep treating it as incidental or finally start treating it as assignment. Ask yourself honestly what people have thanked you for, unprompted, more than once, across different seasons of your life. Not what you're proud of, what they noticed, without you trying to show them. That short list is rarely random. It is usually the clearest inventory of your actual tools that you will ever get, handed to you by people who had no idea they were handing you anything at all. Which brings us to the fourth sign, and this one is quieter than the others. But for a great many of you, it may be the loudest one once you finally learn to hear it correctly. Picture it this way. Imagine you had accepted an assignment before you ever arrived here. Something significant, something that genuinely mattered. And then the moment you actually arrived, the memory of accepting it was wiped clean, the way a slate gets wiped before the next lesson begins. You wouldn't remember the mission, but you would carry a feeling, a low, persistent hum underneath your ordinary life, the sense that there was something you were supposed to be doing, even though you could no longer name what. That hum has a name. Sign number 4 is a restlessness that has nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with a very specific fear. The fear of reaching the end of your life without having become what you were capable of becoming. This is different from wanting a promotion or a bigger paycheck. Plenty of people want more money and sleep just fine at night. This is something else entirely. It is the particular ache of lying awake and thinking, not, I want more, but I have more inside me than I have ever actually used. It is the sense that somewhere along the way, in some room, at some hour, you agreed to something, a version of your life, a scope of what you were here to do, and then the ordinary noise of an ordinary week made you forget the agreement had ever been made. That is what this restlessness actually is. Not anxiety without a cause, a memory without a name. And life, if you pay attention to it closely enough, does not let that memory disappear entirely. It leaves clues along the way, almost like it's trying to jog something loose in you. The recurring dream that will not stop repeating, no matter how many years pass between occurrences. The stranger's offhand comment that lands too precisely to be coincidence. The pull toward a subject, a skill, a group of people that you cannot fully explain and also cannot ignore, no matter how many times you talk yourself out of it. The tears that show up during a moment that shouldn't have moved you that much, unless some part of you recognized something the rest of you had genuinely forgotten. People who are being prepared for a larger calling tend to report this exact same restlessness, almost word for word, regardless of their background, their income, their culture, or their upbringing. Not, I want to succeed, I want to become who I was actually supposed to become, and I am genuinely terrified of running out of time before I get there. If that fear lives in you, if you have ever lain awake more afraid of wasted potential than of outright failure, take that seriously. It is not neurosis, and it is not simply a personality quirk to be managed with better time management. It is the fourth sign, and it exists precisely because some part of you already remembers the assignment, even while the rest of you has spent years trying to talk yourself out of believing it was ever real. Notice, too, how this restlessness rarely responds to achievement the way you'd expect it to. You hit the goal, you get the title, you finally buy the house, and the ache is still there a week later, mostly untouched. That is usually the clue that the restlessness was never about accomplishment in the first place. It was about alignment. about whether the life you're building actually matches the assignment underneath it, or whether it simply looks impressive from the outside while missing the point entirely. We are past the halfway point now, and I want you to notice something before we go any further. Trauma is no longer just trauma to you. Distance from God is no longer just a gap in your upbringing. A talent is no longer just a talent. Restlessness is no longer just restlessness. They are beginning to connect, and they are about to connect further still. There is a real difference between someone who is mildly interested in self-improvement and someone who cannot stop pursuing it, no matter how much they've already learned. The first person reads a book occasionally and moves on with their week. The second person cannot walk past the subject of psychology, consciousness, healing, spirituality, or human behavior without being pulled toward it, over and over, for years, sometimes decades, regardless of how many answers they've already collected along the way. Sign number 5 is the need for transformation, not a passing curiosity about growth, but an actual internal requirement for it that never seems to fully switch off. If that describes you, you have probably wondered why you can't simply relax into an ordinary life the way so many people around you seem to manage without effort. Why you keep circling the same questions about identity and meaning long after most people have quietly stopped asking them and settled into whatever life they landed in. The distinction that actually matters is this: most people live from conditioning. They inherited a set of beliefs, a set of reactions, a way of moving through the world, and they never really examine any of it. They simply run the program installed in childhood and call it personality. There is nothing shameful in that. It is how most human beings operate, most of the time, and it is not a moral failing on anyone's part. But some people cannot stay asleep inside that program, even when they genuinely try to. Something in them keeps waking up and asking, wait, is this actually true? Or is this just what I was taught to believe? Is this really who I am? Or is this simply the role I learned to play to survive my family, my culture, my early wounds? That waking up is rarely comfortable. It is often lonelier than staying asleep, because the people closest to you may still be running their original programming while you are actively, quietly, rewriting yours. If you have spent years unable to settle for the unexamined version of your own life, if growth has never once felt optional to you, even on the days you wished it could be, that compulsion is not random. It is the 5th sign. The people who go on to walk in a larger purpose are almost never the ones who accepted their conditioning quietly and stayed. They are the ones who kept waking up, again and again, even when waking up cost them their comfort. Think about the friend or relative who seems genuinely content running the same script their whole life, same beliefs their parents handed them, same reactions, same unexamined assumptions about what a good life looks like, and they seem, by most outward measures, perfectly at peace. There is nothing wrong with that life, but you already know, if you are honest, that it is not your life. You tried it on at some point, the unquestioned version, and it did not fit. Something in you kept working at the seams until they came apart, and you have been rebuilding ever since, one honest question at a time. Now we come to the sign that tends to be the most painful to recognize, because most people spend years trying to forget it ever happened, instead of understanding what it was actually doing to them the whole time. Not every hard season qualifies for this. This isn't the ordinary difficulty of a bad month or a hard year that eventually passes. This is the addiction that finally cost you something you cannot get back. The divorce that ended not just a marriage, but the entire identity you'd built your adult life around. The business that failed publicly, taking your sense of competence down with it in front of people you respected. The diagnosis, the death. The morning you woke up and understood, with total and unwelcome clarity, that you could not keep living as the person you had been up to that point. Sign number 6 is what gets called rock bottom, a collapse severe enough that the old version of you simply could not survive it intact. What makes rock bottom different from every hard moment that came before it is this. Rock bottom doesn't simply hurt you, it ends something. It makes it functionally impossible to keep operating as your old self, because your old self's entire strategy, whether that was control, performance, self-reliance, or simple avoidance, has just been proven, undeniably, not to work. There is a phrase from the Christian contemplative tradition for what happens next. They call it the dark night of the soul, a season where the old sense of certainty disappears entirely, not as punishment, but as clearing. The scaffolding has to come down before anything real can be built in its place, and no one enjoys watching their own scaffolding fall. And this is where surrender enters, and I want to be precise about what that word actually means here, because it gets misused constantly, treated as a synonym for defeat. Surrender is not giving up. Surrender is the recognition that your ego, the identity you built to survive, to be liked, to look competent, to stay in control, was never actually equipped to carry the weight of your real assignment. The old self has to die, not because dying is somehow noble in itself, but because there is no room for what comes next, while the old self is still occupying every inch of the space. If you have been through a collapse severe enough that you genuinely could not go back to who you were before it, not because you didn't want to, but because that version of you no longer had anywhere left to stand, I want you to hear this clearly. That was not simply loss. It was demolition. And demolition only happens where something new is about to be built. Think of the person who loses everything in a business failure at 40, the kind of failure that makes the local paper, and who spends a year in something close to shame before anything shifts. What shifts, eventually, is not the circumstances. It is the identity underneath them. The version of that person who needed the business to prove their worth has to die before a version capable of building something truer can take its place. From the outside, it looks like ruin. From the inside, years later, it is almost always described the same way. The worst thing that ever happened to me, and also the doorway. Which brings us, finally, to the 7th sign, the one that quietly ties every other sign together. Most people, when something difficult happens, ask exactly one question. How do I get out of this? It's a completely reasonable question, and there's nothing wrong with asking it. But there is another kind of person who, somewhere in the middle of asking, "How do I get out of this?" feels a second question rise underneath it, whether they invited it or not. What is this trying to teach me? Sign number 7 is a compulsive, almost involuntary need to find meaning in what happens to you, an inability to write anything off as simply random. That second question changes everything about how a life gets interpreted, from the inside. It is the difference between "Why is this happening to me?" spoken as an accusation against your own existence, and "What is this preparing me for?" spoken as a genuine, open question to whatever is larger than you. I'll say this carefully, because I don't want to overstate what can honestly be claimed here. Physics has never proven that the universe is watching you personally, and I won't pretend otherwise. But there is something worth sitting with, in the way certain physicists describe the observer, not as separate from what's being observed, but as part of the outcome itself. Your attention is not a passive camera recording a fixed, indifferent world. It participates in what you notice, in what you interpret, and eventually, in what you become capable of seeing at all. I'm not telling you this proves anything about your calling. I'm telling you it's a strange enough mirror that it's worth glancing into before you dismiss the question entirely. There is an old story, one of the oldest of its kind, about a man sold into slavery by his own brothers, imprisoned on a false accusation, forgotten by everyone who could have helped him, and who eventually rose to save the very people who betrayed him from famine. When he finally stood in front of his brothers, with every reason in the world to destroy them, he said something that has outlived him by thousands of years. "You meant this for evil, but it was meant for good. Not the evil didn't happen. It happened exactly as badly as it sounds. But the meaning of it was not settled by the people who caused it. It was settled by what it was eventually used for." If you cannot stop asking why, if you have never once been able to accept a setback as pure coincidence, if some part of you keeps reaching for the pattern underneath the pain, no matter how tired that reaching makes you, that reaching is not a symptom to medicate away. It is the seventh sign, and it may be the loudest one of all, because it has been running quietly beneath every other sign this entire video. So let's put it all together, because on their own, these 7 signs are interesting. Together, they start to function as something closer to a mirror. The difficulty you survived built a capacity most comfortable lives never require in the first place. The distance from God, followed by the crisis that finally forced you to look up, gave you a relationship with the divine you actually chose, instead of one you merely inherited without ever examining it. The natural gift you have spent years minimizing was never decoration. It is the exact tool your assignment requires. The restlessness you couldn't explain was never anxiety without a source. It was a memory without a name. The need for transformation that never let you rest inside your conditioning is what kept you awake while the people around you slept comfortably inside theirs. The collapse that ended your old identity was not simply damage, it was demolition, clearing space for something that couldn't have existed while the old structure was still standing. And the compulsive need to find meaning underneath everything that happens to you is not a coping mechanism to be corrected. It is the part of you that already suspects your life has been building towards something, even on the days you couldn't name what that something was. None of this proves you were chosen in some special, exclusive sense that separates you from everyone else watching tonight. That was never the claim, and it never will be. The claim is that you were called, the same word, the same offer, extended without exception to every person who has ever lived. Not everyone answers. Most people, if we're being honest, spend their entire lives quietly managing the discomfort of the call, rather than actually responding to it. It is worth being honest, too, about how many signs are enough. You do not need all 7 to be true of you tonight. 2 or 3, held with real honesty, are already more than most people ever sit down long enough to count. The 7 signs were never a checklist you pass or fail. They are 7 separate doors into the same room, and you only ever needed to walk through one of them to end up standing inside it. So this is what I want you to do with the next few minutes, because I promised you something practical, and I intend to deliver on that. Choose one sign, just one, whichever hit you hardest tonight, and sit with a single question about it. Not why did this happen to me? Ask instead, what did this prepare in me? If it was the difficulty from your early life, ask what capacity it built that an easier path never would have required you to build. If it was the distance from God, ask what a relationship you actually choose instead of one you merely inherited, might look like starting from here, today, not from your childhood. If it was the gift you've spent years minimizing, ask what it might mean to use it on purpose instead of by accident, the way you have been using it your whole life so far. If it was the restlessness, ask what the assignment might actually be, now that you're finally willing to consider it has a name, even if you can't fully spell that name out yet. If it was the collapse, ask what could not possibly have existed while your old identity was still standing in the way of it. And if it was the meaning seeking itself, the question underneath every other question, simply keep asking it, out loud if that helps. Do not rush to resolve it. Some questions are meant to be carried for a while, not answered on the first attempt. Write the question down if that helps you hold it. Say it out loud in an empty room if that helps you hear it more clearly than thinking it ever will. The goal tonight was never to arrive at a perfect answer. The goal was to stop treating your life as a series of disconnected accidents and start treating it as a pattern finally worth taking seriously. Give it 24 hours before you decide the question didn't work. Meaning rarely arrives on command, the moment you ask for it, the way a vending machine delivers on the first press of a button. It tends to arrive sideways, a few hours later, while you're doing something unrelated, washing a dish or driving a familiar road, and a piece of the answer simply surfaces on its own. That is not a failure of the exercise. That is usually how this particular kind of clarity actually works. And if nothing surfaces at all in the next day, ask the question again tomorrow. Some of the 7 signs take longer to answer than others, especially the ones tangled up with grief or with people you still love despite what happened. There is no deadline on this. The pattern has been sitting in your life for years already. It can wait a little longer for you to see it clearly, because this is where all of this actually lands. Being chosen was never about being better. It was always about becoming available. And availability is not a feeling you simply wait to arrive on its own, the way weather arrives. It is a decision you make, usually on an ordinary day, long after the 7 signs have already finished their work on you, quietly, in the background, while you were busy living what looked like an unremarkable life. You have spent this entire hour recognizing pieces of your own story in language you may never have had for it before tonight. That recognition did not happen by accident, of algorithm or timing. Whatever led you here tonight, whatever restlessness, whatever question, whatever quiet ache you couldn't quite name, it carried you to exactly this moment, listening to exactly this sentence, at exactly this hour of your life. Think about everything that had to line up for you to be here right now, hearing this, at this point in your life, instead of 5 years ago when you might not have been ready to hear it, or 5 years from now when it might have arrived too late to matter. That kind of timing is not something either of us engineered. The real question was never whether you were chosen. Every person listening to my voice right now was called, the same way every person before you was called, and the same way every person after you will be called too. The only real question left standing is one nobody else can answer on your behalf. Now that you have heard it, now that the 7 signs are no longer scattered across your history, but sitting together in front of you for the first time, how are you going to answer? If something in this found you tonight, don't let it end here. Follow this channel, not as a favor to me, but as a small act of commitment to the version of yourself that is finally paying attention. Following is a strange, quiet ritual when you think about it honestly. It is you telling your own attention, in a small and repeatable way, that this matters enough to keep coming back to. Share this with 5 people you genuinely think of the moment you hear the word calling. Not everyone you know, just the 5 who actually need exactly this. You already know who they are. One of them crossed your mind the moment I said the number 5. Leave a comment telling me, honestly and in your own words, which of the 7 signs hit you the hardest tonight. And tell me what you want to understand next, because this conversation isn't finished. It's only the beginning of it. You did not arrive here to stay the same. You arrived here to remember.